Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club of Australia here in Canberra. My name is Tim Shaw. I'm a director of the board, and on behalf of President Laura Tingle, our board and management, welcome to the 2022 Canberra Writers Festival. The Lucky Laundry is the conversation we're having today at lunch, and we are delighted to welcome to the club Nathan Lynch. The Lucky Laundry, how the Aussie economy got hooked on the world's dirtiest cash. In conversation with Michael West, will you please warmly welcome our special guest today for this Lucky Laundry conversation, Mr. Nathan Lynch and Michael West. Please welcome our guests.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. If I could just pay respects to the First Nations people upon whose land we are gathering. Respects to the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. And thank you all for coming today. It's great to see a good turnout. It's an incredible privilege to have, well, he's a bit of an old mate, actually. So we've known each other as journalists for many years, Nathan and I. We sort of overlap a little bit. I do a bit more multinational tax avoidance and he does a bit more sort of money laundering and stuff. But it's always a privilege to have him writing for the website, which we operate, because unlike most finance journalists, Nathan is actually an exquisite writer. Usually finance journalists are sort of upbraided by other journalists as not being real journalists because they write about business and all that boring stuff. But this book is, and I'm not on a cut of the proceeds, is a really good read. It reads like a crime thriller. It's fantastic. And that's because it is a crime thriller. But the dollars involved and the public interest involved is absolutely immense. So, Nathan, the extent of the problem, when I read the book, obviously I knew quite a bit of it, not some of the great anecdotes of you hanging around in seedy Hong Kong bars, mate, putting your journalistic experience to good order. But if you could just tell us about there's a touch of sadness in this too, for a lost Aussie dream. So it actually, particularly the ending, I didn't quite break into tears, but give us an example, give us a feel for the extent of this problem and what it's doing to our democracy.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's great to be here and great to be here with all of you. So appreciative for your interest in the book and, just for keeping the pressure on here in Canberra on the government to address these issues, which is critically important. And in terms of the scale of the problem that we face, I mean, it is enormous. Turning a blind eye to criminal money threatens, it's not just dollars, and in the book we tell this through human stories. Because, this is our democracy. You can't turn a blind eye to the world's kleptocrat money, as we heard this morning from Bill Browder, and let that come in here and find a safe home in Australia and expect that it won't taint your democracy, that money isn't a Faustian pact that brings with it a lot of harm to society and really undermines the quality of our way of life, which is based around integrity and low corruption and, importantly, the Aussie dream. That's one of the saddest things about this, is that it is part of the picture of the demise of the great Australian dream, of being able to earn an income, do an honest job, have a house over your head in which to raise a family, And homes have really gone from being the great Aussie dream to the new great Aussie dream, which is a negatively geared investment portfolio. And what that does, I believe, is it kind of robs our young people and our next generation of their affinity to the country and their hope, that they can have the same thing that their parents had. And clearly, as we explore in the book, and we'll explore today, Michael, the criminal element is a significant part of that picture.
All right, well, to get to the guts of it then, and this may come as a shock to people who aren't au fait with ANL-CTF, which is anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing laws. Back in 2005 or 2006, the first tranche of the ANL-CTF laws to combat counter-terrorism financing and money laundering were enacted. And those laws captured banks, casinos and bullion dealers. The banks, of course, with Westpac and Commonwealth Bank, haven't exactly shone since with their big things a few years ago, but the guts of it is that FATF, which is an international monitoring body, the Financial Action Task Force, deems Australia to be a laggard. And Nathan will go into this in detail, but we are regarded as being almost pariah status now, because the second tranche of these laws, tranche 2, is simply known, which is meant to cover lawyers, accountants, and of course, real estate agents, property developers. 15 years later, these laws have still not been enacted. And we have Nathan's closer to it, but every year I call whoever's portfolio and they juggle it around, and it was in Home Affairs, and it goes to the AG's department where it is now. And, oh yes, stakeholder deliberations. There are all sorts of excuses made. And I said, well, who are these mysterious stakeholders? Because we know who they are. They're property people, lawyers and accountants. But there's no visibility beyond that, apart from what Nathan would know a lot more. But the fact is, these laws are going to be under pressure from now to bring these laws in, to enact the second tranche, because Australia is a money laundering paradise.
It's half true. So, we've got this really fascinating situation here in Australia where we have incredibly strong laws covering the financial services sector and casinos and bullion dealers. So we've done half the job, as Michael said, in 2006. And we're also really fortunate that we have this incredible government agency called AUSTRAC that few people know about, but it's part of the intelligence infrastructure, and it sits there and it gets all the information from the private sector. When they see something suspicious, they're legally obligated to report it through to AUSTRAC. And then AUSTRAC disseminates all that criminal intelligence. Money is the lifeblood of profit-motivated crime. So AUSTRAC is analysing, feeding, developing that intelligence, and then handing it out to all of its partner agencies that then use that in their investigations and prosecutions. So it's been incredibly successful. You saw the case against Australia's 2 most influential companies, Commonwealth Bank and Westpac, where this agency had the courage to take them on and levied $2 billion in fines for the Commonwealth, but more importantly, changed the culture across the whole banking sector. So I can happily say that banks are now doing a very good job of feeding this intelligence through. And they're real partners with the Commonwealth in the fight against financial crime. But of course, we built half a dam wall. So, is my mic working? Just dropped out? Yeah. Could be the battery. I'll just shout. So we've built half a dam wall, and it's sort of like damming half the Yangtze and then wondering why the water is flowing around and still coming through. And then when there's a complaint about this, they say, oh, well, let's build the dam wall higher. It's ridiculous. So what we really need to do as a country is have the courage to say, we don't want to be a home for the world's dirty money. We don't want to turn a blind eye as international kleptocrats and corrupt officials from across the Asia Pacific park their funds with impunity in Australia. We want to end this. And that involves that second tranche of those laws, because as you can imagine, if you're washing money in the big complex schemes like Bill Browder talked about, that's not a cottage industry. You need the best legal advice, the best accounting advice, and more often than not, you need an amenable real estate agent.
Can we just give a couple of examples about how the money then is washed? I mean, you have many of them in the books, and there's so many financial instruments you can deploy and so many people you can deploy to help you, because the dollar figures are absolutely huge. And I think we know that money gets laundered through pokies and through cash businesses, but the more complex ones, like the one we're having a giggle about this morning, the Magnitsky stuff, just explain where we got. We went through Russia. This is Russian money being laundered into Australia and ending up in entities like the Australian Wool Ugberts Corporation.
Ugberts Corporation, innocuously named Australian companies that sound exactly like you would name a company if you were sitting in Moscow and saying, Vlad, how will we open an Australian company? What about the Ugboot? So these companies are almost comical. They're just shell companies, and the money flows down. So I can show you at the end an I2 chart of where some of that Magnitsky money, which we've traced back, came all the way through Estonia, Lithuania, washed through Eastern Europe, then down into Australia and Australian corporations and through Australian lawyers and accountants that structured this. So it's a huge problem. So of that 230 million that Browder talked about 4 million of that ended up being washed through Australia, and the rest went through the international laundromat. So we're just not doing enough, really. I mean, there's your oligarchs up there swanning about in the sun, living the life of Riley, when their assets are parked happily in Australia. And one of the sad truths is corrupt politicians and gangsters and oligarchs, they hate the rule of law. They hate strong law enforcement until they park their money somewhere, and then they love it. So they're generating wealth often offshore and then bringing it into Australia, where you've got really tight laws around extradition. It's very hard to prosecute someone. It's very hard to seize their assets. And so they want their money in a jurisdiction like Australia. And that's the challenge we have. So it's not just criminal money that's being generated here that's getting moved out of the country to get it away from authorities. It's a two-way street where it flows in both directions.
We had a funny one where we found the Supreme Court of New South Wales was laundering. There were two Russian companies suing each other, and it looked, we didn't say it with absolute 100% conviction, but they ran up costs in this legal matter suing each other. And New South Wales Supreme Court, and it's basically just a way of using the court system to create a fake dispute to launder money. So the ingenuity going on here is incredible. But we did some numbers last night trying to work out, because there's no doubt that black money in Australia's property market does fuel the prices. And if you look at any chart of Australia's resi property market versus any other market in the world, it's just outstripped a lot of them. So it's not everything. It's negative gearing. It's a lot of other things. Of course, for those of us that own any residential property, this is a great thing because our wealth keeps going up. But of course, this is contributing to a generational inequity and many younger Australians, of course, and with the tax shelters in DIY super and so on, are really facing. And I tell you what, if they're onto it, I just don't think there's an understanding, if they're onto it, that their taxes, they'll be working extra long and hard through their lives to pay for our super and to break into the property market, which is so high. So we're trying to work out, of course, if you've got property, it's a good thing. We were trying to put some numbers around it. So we're talking a $10 trillion market. It's the biggest market in the country.
Well, there's an error in the book, because when I wrote it and it went to print, it was a $9 trillion property market. It's now 10.2. So that gives you an idea of how quickly, between writing and going to print and publication, we've got another $1 trillion worth of wealth in property. So huge money. Now, if you think about it, Australian GDP, $2.2 trillion a year. Property market, $10.2 trillion. It's about 4.7 times Australian GDP tied up in property. Now compare that with America, United States, 25 trillion GDP and a property market worth 43 trillion. So it's about 1.7 times GDP. So there is something terribly wrong in Australia with this imbalance in the economy. Why is so much of our wealth getting poured into an asset class that's completely unproductive? Really housing, I would joke and say you can't export housing, unfortunately, but you kind of can by selling your property and your housing to foreigners, which is one of the ways that we get money into the country. So it really has, as I say in the book, it's a hydra that has wrapped its limbs around the lucky country, and it's captured so many parts of our society, our politicians, our economic system, our banks. Everyone is riding in an economy that's based on these heavily elevated property prices. And in the theme of yesterday's presentation, there's a national security risk there too. Because as we saw with the South China Sea issue, where suddenly Australian barley and crayfish and lobster and wine was getting embargoed and blocked as a geopolitical move. Well, imagine if that were to happen with the weaponisation of the Aussie property market. So this is big, important stuff.
So the contention is that So when the young aspiring house owners they're bidding against people who are acting as agents for sort of, well, not necessarily Mexican drug cartels, but if you glamorise it to the nth degree, you know, a lot of Chinese money, obviously, because the black, anything more than 50,000 US that comes out of China is illegal. You're not allowed as a Chinese national to take more than 50 US $1,000 out. So
right.
that means that's all black money. So you would have...
There's a complication there because we don't have capital controls. So in money laundering, there has to be a predicate crime before the money moves. Now, in Australia, we don't recognise capital controls. So when a Chinese person has legitimately earned money and they want to get it out to a safe haven like Australia, we say that's perfectly legitimate. But unfortunately, to get their money out, they're drawn into the world of money laundering because they've got to go to the dark market to get that money above $50,000 across the border. So you've got all of this legitimate money from China coming down through illegitimate channels. And then the banks and everyone here is trying to weed out those, who's a bad actor and who's a good person with honestly earned money that just wants to get it to Australia. So it's a very complicated situation, but a lot of that money coming from China isn't necessarily dirty money. It's money that was not meant to have been taken out of the country.
So it's black money from their perspective, but
it's
not
black
from
money
ours.
from their perspective. And of course, there's loads of black money.
So the bulk of it would be money from China, but it's hard to put actual numbers around this. And when we've written stuff about it, people have said, oh, no, that's rubbish. There are other factors in the property market. Well, of course there are. But we're trying to work out what would happen if suddenly they decided to bring these laws in that they've been talking about for 15 years.
There it is, it's outlived 6 Australian leaders. And again, my book is a little out of date because it's now 7, including Scott Morrison. So it's just this can that gets eternally kicked down the road. It's got bipartisan support, tripartisan if you include the Greens, and yet how are we an international pariah? What insight does that give us into democracy and the power of lobbying, which is sort of, the book started out as a money laundering story, but it inevitably led me back to lobbyland.
Well, so you've had to deal with some interesting characters too in the book, on your travels, because as the regulatory guru for Thomson Reuters, Nathan goes to conferences and not like the ordinary reporter like me that just has a crack from outside. He's sort of in the tent as well, dealing with the people inside, and that's a challenge as a journalist to be able to report properly when you know these people and go to dinner with them, so on. So tell me,
on both sides of the ledger.
On both.
The crooks are pretty interesting as well. They've got some good stories, and as a storyteller, you're like a moth to the flame. You're always chasing the best story, and unfortunately, that leads you into some very undesirable predicaments sometimes. So a couple of your stars in the book. You've got this guy. What's his name? Mikey. Bill Micah.
Bill Micah, sorry, yeah.
Can I find Bill? There he is, the silver fox.
So tell us Bill Micah's background. He's like a secret agent, really.
Yeah. So he was let's go back there. So Bill was a undercover agent. He was with the Mounties. He started out as a bond trader in finance, and then he joined the Mounties in Canada, and they couldn't believe their luck because the police were suddenly starting to tackle these money laundering cases and use financial intelligence, not just to trace the assets after they found a crime, but to reverse engineer it. So let's look at the financial evidence, the breadcrumbs there, and trace back to the crimes. And so Bill was at the driving end of that, and he he's a slick-looking guy, as you can see, very connected in finance. So he adopted he went through the undercover school and adopted the character of a money launderer for a Colombian cartel. And the Americans got him down to Miami, and they gave him a boat and kitted it out with cameras and microphones. And he basically went around Miami inviting people to come onto his boat and cut a deal to launder money for his Colombian client. And he got 130 of Miami's finest on the boat, on tape. They'd walk out of there with a suitcase full of notes. So, that was how he got started. And then in the book, by a circuitous turn of events, he ends up getting a mandate. It's hard to believe this is truth, but but it is. He gets a mandate from the Chinese Ministry of Public Security to come down to Australia and start hunting down assets of the corrupt politicians that have fled China. And so he's roaming the streets of Australia, suburban Australia, trying to get hold of these assets and do what they call civil recoveries. So, you know, the book opens with a murder where a bag man for a money launderer was shot 5 times in the head on the streets of Sydney and left to die on the footpath. You know, and then we go through this, and this is all happening in suburban Australia. You know, hopefully it's quite an eye-opener for people to see that this world is playing out in the shadows.
We were having a small tete-a-tete last night about the pokies, because of course the pokies, I've done a bit of work on the pokies, and New South Wales clubs is the biggest, most profitable gambling sector in the biggest gambling state, in the biggest gambling country per capita in the world. New South Wales clubs. And the amount of money, I went through 15 sets of accounts and had a look at the amount of money these guys, it's not turnover, we're talking income of, 60 to 80% is pokies money, food and bev is nothing, that's a lost leader. And, you know, things like the Mounties, which has taken over the club up near me at Harbord Diggers, in a sort of $60 million deal. I mean, these are meant to serve local communities, but they're now huge casinos. And of course, now, there's a bit of contention because we've got Troy Stoltz, who's a whistleblower, and he's come out against Clubs New South Wales, saying that they're thugs and that they're trying to bully him with lawyers and so on, and that money laundering through the clubs is a serious issue. And then I've gone and talked to a couple of people and said, no, not really, because, you know, there's all these surveillance cameras everywhere and it's digital technology. So, of course, with digital technology, you just stick it on a computer program and you find out, oh, look, there's a huge unnatural amount of activity going on here. And technology, of course, is, as you deal in the book, is one of the big factors in surveillance now and regulation. But just tell me, you think that it is actually an issue, that despite all this capacity to surveil, that it's worse than people sticking $100 bills through ATMs, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got the most motivated. So if you think about it, a money launderer is able to charge 4 to 5% for what they do. So they're highly motivated, right? You know, $100 million of criminal funds, which is, we all heard in the Crown saga, that was the sort of money that was just changing hands. $100 million, the launderer, the bag man, clips $4 to $5 million of that. So can you imagine how motivated they are? As Jack Lang said, you know, if you're going to back a nag in life, back self-interest. You know she's trying. These guys are really trying hard. And so their ways of moving money and circumventing and playing this cat and rat game with authorities is so sophisticated. And it's sort of the bit that people that work at AUSTRAC in financial intelligence or work in the banks in anti-money laundering teams, they love that intellectual chess game, you know, of basically, you know, they're trying to hide the money, you're trying to get it. And technology is a double-edged sword because, as you can imagine now, you know, with the Commonwealth Bank case, you know, that was a classic example of technology being misused. And so you had people, it was so egregious, Westy, that you literally had people on the streets of Sydney turning up with a milk crate, and they would sit down at their milk crate like it was a work stool on the street, and they could shovel up to $600,000 of crack into these machines. And then the bank had real-time clearing, so it would instantly appear, and the handler isn't even in Australia. He sent mules down to do the dirty work, and he sees the money appear in his online account, and then click, it's in Hong Kong for $22. So you think about the money that was available there. Now, that particular channel, when it started, a small amount of money went through it, like $80 or $90 million in the first 6 months. And then 2 years later, $8.9 billion had moved through that channel. We'll never know how much of that was criminal funds because the data simply wasn't collected. So this is the scale of the problem, and you can see there, whether it's a pokey machine or an ATM or a smart ATM, when there's a vulnerability that gets found, it gets ruthlessly exploited until it's closed up. And I guess that's why it's so important that these industry sectors play their part and don't become a witting or unwitting accomplice in the second half of the criminal trade, which is moving money.
And of course, there's the past masters, Star Casino and Crown Resorts, that have been found to be systemic criminal enterprises, and not one director, of course, these are the people with the responsibility for the organisation legally, not one day on holiday in terms of a director's ban. So these signals of punishment that just aren't happening out there when you get people, you know, getting sent to jail for minor misdemeanours, ordinary people. And so there is a problem with the double standards, which is a common theme we discussed. But on the CBA and Westpac
I'll just give one illustration there, which is if you had a guy robbing a bank and his mate was out the front with the car and he jumps in the car and they drive off, the guy in the car is clearly an accomplice to a crime. What if you have a banker who gets the money, turns a blind eye, or any other professional, and drives the getaway car for the loot? You know, we haven't really treated them as participants in the crime enough as we need to really send a message.
These are the gateway professions.
All professions, you know, anyone who handles the money and is knowingly or unknowingly or recklessly complicit in moving dirty money, all the people in the industry are telling me we need to start going after them so that it's not like a company makes a mistake and they disappear with their bonuses and shareholders then pay $1.3 billion. That doesn't send much of a message, does it? So they're all saying we have to start treating this white-collar crime as crime.
So just on the numbers. So in 2017, CBA, was it 57,000 breaches?
Yeah, 53,700.
So they've broken the law 53,700 times. What was the penalty?
Well, they got $700 million penalty, which was
big for the
astronomically
time.
huge. Yeah. You know, a massive result. Because if you think about it, you know, previously ASIC was handing down penalties like $10 million at most. And in some cases, you know, major things like bank bill swap rate rigging, which was our version of the LIBOR catastrophe, the penalty in that one for one bank was $3.3 million. It's not even a library fine, you know. Doesn't register as a parking ticket to a company earning $6 billion profit a year. So yeah,
it's a good earn for the Commonwealth. Though.
It's a good earn for the Commonwealth, and it really drove change.
But then Westpac comes along and says, CBA, hold my beer.
Absolutely.
We'll see your 57,500 and we'll raise you 330. What was the number? 300,000.
Oh,
breaches.
They were into like 21 million breaches.
21 million breaches.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
if you levy the maximum penalty for 21 million breaches, what's your figure?
Well, I worked it out that it was about $400 trillion, which is about 200 years of Australian GDP. So we could have nationalised, we could have, you know, got our banks back in public hands. Yeah, I mean, you know, huge numbers, but that was what brought them to the table. You know, you've got to give your regulatory agencies massive powers if you want them to hold these professionals and major companies to account. If you don't give them that massive stick, you know, we've seen how the banks regarded ASIC and APRA, you know, with what I'd probably call contempt. They were certainly captured regulators, you know, with the revolving door of staff and underfunded and all of those issues and under-resourced by Canberra with laws. Whereas when you move into money laundering, you've got this small agency with 300 staff and a $70 million budget that was wielding inadvertently a huge stick. And I don't even think Canberra realised when they passed those laws what they were actually giving it, because at $21 million per breach, no one realised that every time you're moving money with a deficient compliance program, you're in breach. So the banks just rack up these fines so quickly. And that's what has led to the big cultural change across financial services.
So also there was the factor of the Westpac was being preyed on by pedophiles because there were loopholes specifically to move money to Philippines or Thailand or whatever. And so there was a real human cost in that. I mean, we managed to establish it. The story didn't flourish in the mainstream media. I didn't notice, but we gave it a crack. You wrote a story about it. Is that reasonable to say that they turned the blind eye in this situation?
So they were knowingly turning a blind eye to massive multinational tax evasion. So we're talking tens of billions of dollars. I mean, they were providing services to business, get this right. If you were a really big customer, you could buy a service which gives you a virtual BSB. So what that means is you're a massive multinational company and you have your own BSB number that to the customer looks like an Australian bank branch at Westpac, but it's actually your own corporate BSB and it feeds through to your bank account in Singapore with another bank. So an Australian customer pays you and your money's in Singapore and the ATO can never unravel that. So that was the scale of the impact in terms of tax revenue. Again, this is all black money, it's unquantifiable. So, but it's in the tens of billions that went out the door that way, that was lost to Australian taxpayers that didn't pay for schools and hospitals and roads. And you've then, you've then on top of that got, so that was the complacency really, that was what they knew about. But then, because you don't know what's going on inside your bank, because you're turning that blind eye and you haven't done the work and you haven't invested in your financial crime team, you don't know what's happening in your bank. And so that was why when they started looking, when AUSTRAC started looking, they asked them, what have you been doing with your filters to catch child sex offenders who are engaging in online child sex content? And they were doing nothing. So they'd been given the filters. They were part of an alliance where they were cracking down on this horrific trade and they caught like 25 people and locked them up, through using financial intelligence to detect these transactions going to the Philippines. Westpac wasn't doing any of it. And so inadvertently, because they weren't, you can imagine customers try to do that at another bank and they use these intelligence filters and then get rid of them. So they all end up at Westpac. So Westpac inadvertently, this proud Australian brand inadvertently became the bank of choice for child sex offenders. Horrific. And that was really what was that if it was just a tax issue, they would have litigated it. But when that came out, they had to settle the matter.
Well, the feelings changed a bit in community expectations on tax, of course, too, because it used to be that the double Dutch Irish sandwich was considered to be a glamorous thing and, a good thing to do. But now, you are cheating the public by tax avoidance. So community standards do change things and hopefully, with your book and with further pressure from good old FATF over in Paris on Australian authorities and the present government, your feeling is that it will happen, tranche 2, in the next couple of years, but your fear is that there will be loopholes because the sheer size and importance of the property market and the sheer lobbying muscle and so on. How do you see it playing out?
I think it really requires people to know that this problem exists and let their politicians know that they care. Because if you remember back in 2019, Labor went to the federal election with a whole bunch of reforms around negative gearing and franking credits and things like that, like intergenerational equity issues. And I'd also got Chris Bowen to commit in print to the anti-money laundering laws, to crack down on laundering through real estate and these professions. They lost the election. So the Australian public overwhelmingly seem to be saying, don't touch our honeypots, We want to be a clean country, but not if it means taking our franking credits away or, God forbid, lowering house prices. So that's the issue that we have. We need the public to be saying to our leaders, we care, we want you to fix this up, we want a clean economy, it matters to us. And that way, when they do reform these laws, which I'm convinced will be happening in the next few years, we've just got to keep the pressure on to make sure that they're effective.
To go to the China factor,
Yep.
Vancouver property market, very like the Australian property markets. There was a generational problem. The prices went through the roof in Canada, in this market, and there was a lot of Chinese money coming in. And then they moved and they addressed it legally and it normalised again. Is that...
Yeah, they've just done a massive inquiry, and there was an Australian academic that came up with this model. He called it the Vancouver model. And the reason he called it the Vancouver model was because as an Aussie, calling it the Sydney model would have been a bit controversial. But looking at the way that, you've got this symbiotic relationship between illicit drug markets, for instance. So a lot of drugs now are just chemicals, worthless chemicals that become incredibly valuable by dint of crossing an artificial border. So prohibition and our effectiveness in keeping drugs out kind of becomes our Achilles heel. So you've got the chemicals coming out of ports in Shenzhen in China, the precursor chemicals for meth, moving into markets like Canada and Australia, where it's super valuable. Then illicit cash is generated on the streets of Australia or Canada. And you have a criminal group that wants to get cash out of Australia, and you then have, fortuitously, all those people in China that want hard assets outside the country, and as we said earlier, they're forced to go into dark markets to move that money to get around currency controls. So guess what they do? They just swap their assets. It's like a financial dating agency. So when you hear about people walking in and buying houses with cash, and you think, how do these people get so wealthy? Well, they've got a corresponding loan with an underground lender. And it's not secured by title, it's secured by kneecaps, more often than not. So the person that came in with the cash, that was drug money that brought the house. And there's a title somewhere, probably through an offshore corporation, that gives the person in China the ownership of that Australian house. And then, luckily, the criminal group that sent the drugs over at the start, they get the Chinese yuan in China. So nothing actually moved. They just paired up these transactions. So this is the kind of thing that we're facing. And if you don't have any controls around your gatekeepers, which we don't, can you imagine how easy it is to do that? The lawyer, the accountant, and the real estate agent, the three professions in that chain of custody, don't have to see anything. And we are one of 3 countries in the world, along with the financial powerhouses of Haiti and Madagascar, that have this gaping disregard for those laws. And we've got an international commitment to the FATF to pass those. And they're coming back in 2024 or 2025, they'll be back. And if we haven't moved on it, they are going to rip us to pieces.
So in terms of their raising...
Luckily, we've got Matthias Cormann as the head of the OECD. That's working in our favour.
So in terms of Australia's regard by FATF, by the International Monitoring Agency, are we rated sort of... You said Haiti, any others spring to mind? Are we...
the commonality...
Pakistan is ahead, as I understand.
The commonality is they're all islands, right? But I think Australia is by far the biggest island of those 3. These are jurisdictions that have just said we're not going to push this through. So, as I said, Australia is a conundrum. You've got the world's best, if not one of the best, but probably the best financial intelligence unit in the world here in Australia, in AUSTRAC. They're doing amazing stuff, cutting edge. But when they go out into the international community, because this is an international partnership, they're kind of embarrassed in a sense because they're doing so well with the laws they have, but there's this gaping blind spot. So that's why we are this conundrum. The FATF says, you guys are doing brilliant work with the laws you have, but where were your politicians for the last 16 years?
So it's a bipartisan issue, obviously. But you think I put the question in again, which I do once every year to whoever's handling ANL-CTF. And so how's it going? How's it going on your plans to bring in this Tranche 2 legislation? I will get back to you. 24 hours later, they get something from the department. We're in advanced discussions with stakeholders regarding, but I sent you the latest comments, and you felt that there was a ray of light there somewhere, a rhetorical ray of light in the approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of our 6-monthly calendar invite. Westy, should we go to Home Affairs or whoever it is that has the portfolio and see what they're going to say? And we get the same canned line every year, you know, stakeholder consultation. We have to be careful of the impact on business, right? But this time, so basically what has happened behind the scenes is with the new government, this realm of anti-money laundering and financial intelligence has moved out of Home Affairs and back into the Attorney General's Department. So that's a really good sign because they're a law-making body and they are committed to doing it in this term of government. And the tone of the response that we got was completely different. So I'm pretty optimistic that we're finally going to see some traction here. And one of the reasons for writing this book was to let people understand what's happening in this hidden dark economy that you just don't get to see, but also to, get angry. We should be angry about this. You know, when you've got a kid turning up at an auction and it's your kid or your grandchildren, can you guarantee that they're not bidding against a buyer's agent for a cartel? You can't. You cannot have that assurance in Australia, and that's totally unforgivable. So get angry, tell your leaders that you care, and let's get some real reform and make sure that we don't end up with window dressing.
So the reform would be, for instance, in tranche 1, which is legislated 15 years ago, if it's a transaction, correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, above $10,000 and you have reason to believe, you don't know where it's come from, reason to have any suspicion, if you're the lawyer, accountant or property guy, you're meant to disclose that. And obviously it doesn't work too well with the casinos and the banks, but having the law in place would condition the behaviour, wouldn't it?
Well, it kind of has worked with the casinos and the banks, right? Because they were lying about what they were doing and they got caught out. And in all those cases, there was a massive sweep of the board and senior management. And in the case of Crown, it's basically led to the fire sale of the property to Blackstone, who's coming in now and putting in world-class risk and compliance systems at last. So the laws were there. The reporting entities weren't taking the government seriously and were fibbing about what they were up to, and they got caught out and it led to change. Whereas none of that is happening in the property sector because there are no laws to give them any jurisdiction. I mean, there's criminal money laundering laws, but what we're talking about here is the gatekeepers, holding them to account.
Disclosure and transparency issue, like a lot of things like tax avoidance. When they brought in those disclosure, transparency things in 2015, Coalition brought them in to their credit. They have worked and they brought billions of dollars in because once a year, all the big tax avoiders, they've got to put out 3 numbers, and one of those numbers is how much tax did you pay last year? So transparency and disclosure is extremely important, particularly money laundering and so on as well. But I think should we?
Yeah, we got 15 minutes
for questions.
Questions.
Can I just say, just quickly though, it is really a terrific read. Nathan is a very gifted writer, and it reads like a crime novel, and it's very good. He'll be around to pick up to sign copies later on if you want to pick up a copy. So why don't we throw it open to questions if anyone has a question about money laundering and financial crime.
Yeah, there's a mic there and there, there's not one anymore because I've got it. So if you want to ask a question, just line up over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. It's very enlightening talk. It seems to me, I'm coming in quite new to this, but you very much identify this second tranche of legislation as being a key in countering some of these issues. But you also mentioned earlier that this has sort of outlasted 8 prime ministers, and you mentioned it's sort of got tripartisan support, I think you said, if you include the Greens. It kind of jumped out at me because I always thought like the Greens are kind of anti-big banks' profits and more about housing for younger people. So I guess with this new parliament, with all the independents and different parties in there, what's your advice so that you don't have just one more Prime Minister get rolled before this gets through?
Great question. This is what I love about coming to Canberra. Look, so on point. You've got this new environment now where the Teals came in on a platform of transparency. So it wasn't specifically around, it was more around an anti-corruption body, right? But it's all related. So, you've got people there that care about this stuff. They've got a lot of seats, they've got a lot of influence, particularly in the Senate, and they're going to wield that influence. So the case that Westy talked about with the grandfathering, that was just quickly tagged to another piece of legislation to get it through in a very pragmatic kind of way. And Labor wasn't going to oppose that. So we're sort of in that environment now where the independents and the Greens have a lot more influence, and they've been very much pushing this money laundering issue from a intergenerational equity perspective, as well as just a general belief in it's terrible. But they've also got people like Peter Wish-Wilson, who is a former investment banker and understands this stuff so well. And he's been this, lone voice for a long time in Parliament speaking out about it. So, I think the big issue is, we've got the perfect storm in Canberra at the moment to deal with it. It's just going to be a question of those really powerful lobbies and how they get to it. And to give you an idea of how powerful those lobbies are, the banking lobby, which you'd think would be the most influential in Australia, right? The banking lobby has been crying out for this reform for a good 5 years because they're doing all the heavy lifting, they're providing all the intelligence, they're getting hammered for failures, and they're saying to Canberra, well, you're hoisting us up on the flagpole or the lamp pole for getting it wrong. Why don't we hold you to the same standard? What did you do when you were in power? So that's sort of where we are now, where we need that light being shone on our politicians to hold them accountable to make this reform, which has complete support across the House. But those lobbying interests have been more powerful than the banking lobby for the past 5 years, which is incredible.
There's just to add to that, there's been some good stuff with the that grandfathering thing that went last week. It was interesting the way it happened. The Greens put it up. I think it was Nick McKinn. Labor backed it. Called Rex Patrick, who'd been pushing it. He's now out. Labor and the Greens, without even debating it, they just went, yep, let's whack this through now. We got the numbers. And they pushed it through. There was no debate, because if they'd had any debate and it ended up in the Australian newspaper overnight or whoever, and they said, oh, the billionaires might have to do this and they could be kidnapped. And so this had been the whole kidnapping debate that Josh Frydenberg put up. So they whisked it through, and Albanese is exercising political will at the moment. I don't think they'll be able to get away with such efficient legislation when it comes to AML, because these lobbies have been lobbying against it for 15 years. And the longer they leave it, of course, politically, the harder these things become. Steve, you could give us chapter and verse on that. Have you got a question? Or
Steve?
Thank you, Michael. I do have a question. Observation, firstly. Look, Nathan, congratulations on the book. You're the first author I've seen at the camp, in fact, any Writers Festival who wears a tie. So congratulations. the most dapper author I've seen. You're not looking too bad either, Westy, just quietly.
We're a foil to each other. I make him look ruggedly handsome, and he makes me look well-dressed.
I live in Sydney and I walk my dog down East Balmain, and when I get down the beautiful harbour, I look across and there's a tall building, fondly known as Packers Pecker, which is Crown Casino. And they just got a licence, I think, to start operating in the last couple of weeks, yeah? So tell me, based on your research, and I'm looking forward to reading the book, how much of that money, which is essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, they're foreign, mainly Chinese high rollers who Crown are targeting, yeah? How much of that money through that casino over the next several years, in your view, is going to be dirty money coming from overseas? How much of it is going to be what? And can AUSTRAC or any other regulator do anything to stop the tide of dirty money coming through all casinos, not just that particular entity, yeah?
Well, Packers Pecker, yeah, I mean, it's now Blackstone's member, I guess, or something like that, because it's changed ownership and, but it's the classic visible example of this problem. And I'll give you an insight into it. So they were being required to run anti-money laundering controls on their gambling activities. So what Star and Crown were doing was antics like a high roller comes down and puts his money through the accommodation business, which is unregulated because it's property. And so you hire a penthouse for the week for $1 million, and then lo and behold, you get comped $1 million worth of chips when you turn up. So that was all unreported. And that was kind of to get around the fact that you're not allowed to gamble in Australia with your Chinese Union Pay cards. So they created a workaround, but unfortunately for them, it was also a work around the AML Act. And so they're in a lot of trouble now. In the tower itself, you're not going to believe this. I hope we're not being filmed. But in that tower, there's all those accommodation units, right? Now, those units, when they sold them, they weren't required to do any checks because, hey, it's the lucky country. So the people that came in and bought those units, imagine who they could be. No one knows. They still don't know. And there is an elevator in that building that takes you from your private apartment down to the gambling floor. So can you imagine the police are saying to me in New South Wales, we can't arrest someone for walking into an apartment with a suitcase. So they've got no visibility in who owns those apartments, but it was literally built as a laundering facility where you buy your apartment, you bring your cash in, jump in the elevator, you're down in the wash house, job done. 4 or 5%, thank you.
And after being pinged for systemic thousands of breaches of the law, they then get rewarded with their second casino license. So,
well, the ownership has now changed. So it's now an American private equity group that owns it. So, that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But they are investing massively in financial crime controls. So I'm hopeful, Steve, that going forward, it's going to be a different environment at Crown. But honestly, it's hard to see how that business can be valued. I mean, it's not you going in and playing roulette with a $5 chip that's making them that wealthy, right? It was always a business model predicated on money laundering, that's casinos. But what we see now is, so how are Blackstone going to make that deal work? It's highly possible they'll hive off all the property assets into a separate listed vehicle and then refloat the casino, job done, and they move on.
My understanding is that we also have a bad reputation for things like ivory trafficking. And I was just wondering how that, so given links to the Asian market and that, I wondered, is that all part of this and trade in endangered species and related goods?
Yeah. I mean, the particularly Australian native fauna, is really highly sought after, and it's been an issue for a long time. One of the sad things about the wildlife trade, it's such a great question, because smuggling cigarettes and wildlife is, if you're going to get involved in crime, that's probably, I don't advocate it, but that is a better risk-reward equation, because if you get done for bringing in illegal cigarettes, it's a revenue offence, not a drug offence. And they're making massive amounts of money on fake cigarettes because they're so heavily taxed. Wildlife is in that same category. It's wildlife tracking, right? So there's once criminal networks get set up for moving contraband, they'll move anything through those supply chains. Lizards, snakes, native fauna, birds, drugs, humans, you name it. So it's a $40 billion a year trade, illegal wildlife, and it's an absolute tragedy. And you've got species like the pangolin under threat. But the exciting thing is, this is global issue now that's really come to top tier. Prince Charles and the Crown in the UK have all said they're supporting this with the World Environment Fund, and the financial intelligence community are working away behind the scenes to detect this stuff. And like they did with the child sex traffickers, where they ended up with 70 or 80 people who were arrested on the basis of financial intelligence, they're doing the same thing with wildlife. So there are huge bright spots. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, as an aspiring journo, as you're approaching this topic, which is incredibly complex and often very difficult to articulate to the general public, what was your, strategy going in, and what do you think is necessary to enthuse more public support in making changes to this sort of legislation around the world and in Australia? I know the ICIJ, I guess, with the offshore financing and tax havens, they did a lot of work, but that was just because it was such a massive collaborative effort that they were able to have huge impacts. What do you think is the best thing to do here in Australia, especially with laws, defamation law kind of holding us back in some ways? And I would add on to that, with your example in Canada, what was the ultimate tipping point in Vancouver that pushed them to actually make a change?
Great question. And look, unless you want to change your career path, which I'd highly advocate as a, and Westy would as well. No, I think it's fantastic that that's what you want to do. And, in that career, if I could just say, find something you're passionate about and just go for it, Unfortunately, in media and publishing, you don't often get the change that you want. You publish big story, it blows up for a few days, and the news cycle rolls on. So that would demoralise you if you didn't just love what you're doing and so passionate about it. So in your career, it's going to be awesome, and just pick a topic that just fires you up so that even if you feel like you're not getting anywhere, you keep going. And you want to have a bit of stubbornness. Westy and I have been banging on about this for 15 years and we're still going. But yeah, in terms of, how we can get the message out there, I just think, what other alternative is there? Like, do we sit back and give up and stop? No way. We've just got to, we've been born into such a lucky country. And one of the characters from my book is here today, one of the great people in the book. And they're inspirational people. A lot of them are migrants that have come here, and they're so grateful to be in Australia and a free and liberal and rule of law country. And they come here as immigrants and they just want to fight for it, A lot of these people that are heroes in the financial crime space, they've come here and they just are passionate about Australia and defending it. So that's all it takes. It just takes all of us to, sometimes we forget how fortunate we are here in Australia, and it just takes us to remember that. And, people like you, the next generation, and the people at the table at the back there that are coming through and going, we're not going to let this democracy die on our watch, I think is so inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you for this. I have two questions to ask. The first one is about the number of directors of organisations in Australia that I haven't seen come before the courts under Commonwealth legislation. But the second area that I'd like you to comment on is the fact that the property market seems to be mainly a state government legislation issue, and I'd like you to comment on both of those. Thank you.
Shall I do directors? I'll do directors, yeah. I mean, I rabbit on about this ad infinitum, about the double standards. The bloke breaks up with his wife, breaks into the local sports store, steals a few bottles of grog, goes to jail. That was one that I wrote about, probably not a long sentence, but at the same time, there's some massive financial crime going on that damages so people end up losing their life savings and so on, and the directors aren't even banned. And we've seen it with the systemic criminality in the casino sector, banking. Brian Hart's a fell on his sword. He was the Westpac chief executive. There is some point, you have to, have done quite a bit wrong or have a huge stuff up going on underneath you to finally accept responsibility as a director in corporate Australia, unfortunately. To go double barrel on that question, the way for change, and going to that earlier answer, I found with the tax avoidance stuff was there's 3 steps. It has to be identified, which is what we're doing now increasingly, and it has to be put out there in the public domain so people go, yeah. Specifically, the people are being hurt, because if most people here look like fairly well heeled, you probably got property, so you go, well, we're going to give that wealth to our kids anyway. So you're not that motivated. But there's the community engagement with the problem. And then people write to politicians and they see them at events and they say, what about this? And so then the politicians react to address the thing and they make the reforms. And that's what happened with multinational tax avoidance. My contacts at the tax office say that billions and billions of dollars have come in because of transparency reforms and transparency disclosure. Same deal in this sector, huge. And so it's a community engagement, forcing the politicians to act. In this case, there is a conflict of interest. Manalbo himself, I think he's doing a terrific job, still on honeymoon period. He's got 4 properties. Others in his ministry have got 8 properties, all negatively geared. So I'm not saying they're corrupt or particularly tainted, but it's like there's conflict of interest amongst every person in the Australian Parliament that has, and all the people that report on it in the media as well, with more than one home, with the negative gearing, and just with property prices. Because if, as we suspect, there is $100 billion, we did some back of envelope stuff, but we don't know, but it could be $100 billion. If the market's $2 trillion, say Australian 3 trillion in black money, and Australia is the #1 destination with its Westminster political system, stability, protection of assets, then it's not beyond. It's a fair call that maybe it's 50 to 100 billion. This is black money.
This is black money, so by definition, it's all speculative, right? Because you don't know the stuff that you're not seeing. But yeah, I mean, it's an enormous. I mean, if you've got a $10 trillion property market, safe to say $1 trillion of that is money that should not be here.
So you pull it out, and prices won't be, if there's not, and probably 40.
Well, as they're doing now in the UK and Canada and places like that, they're seizing Russian-linked assets, and the state's ending up with them. So that's an interesting.
So it could have a deleterious effect on the property prices, and if you're geared in property, then you're not going to want that. So there's a lot of political opposition, I would say, to these reforms.
And then on the state-federal issue, fascinating observation. That is the case. So we can see that in the casinos pretty clearly, right? That it's all state-based regulation, and then when you had the Bergen inquiry and the Victorian and Queensland, and every state's now had an inquiry and found that there were 2 people overseeing these casinos. And in WA, they were going on fishing trips together. The head of the regulator and the head of legal and compliance at the casino would go out on fishing trips on a boat that they referred to in their own emails as the good ship Compliance. So that was the sort of state-based regulatory model that you had. And the only federal agency that has its claws into casinos is AUSTRAC. So the federal government's pragmatic, and it's using that agency to get in there and clean them up because it's a national security issue, because of the transnational crime aspect. So yeah, the state-federal thing is the same in property. Until we get these federal laws, that will at least give the federal government oversight over the state-based property markets, because at the moment they don't have it.
I'm interested in understanding a little bit more about what controls there are around gambling per se. You're talking about Clubs New South Wales being the biggest, essentially, casino or gambling, and we're the biggest gambling country in the world. So there's regulatory controls on this issue around casinos, but what's happening in the rest of the gambling industry? And more importantly, what about online gambling? I mean, all these things have become huge, and you can't tell me that money laundering isn't occurring through those processes just as much as casinos. So is there any regulatory controls happening around that? And is that all state-based?
It's just a casual observation, it's very addictive. When my daughter was 14, she was singing the sports bet thing on the thing. Once you kick off and you start, if you've got a problem with it, so there is a huge problem, I think, with this online gaming, and a lot of hidden victims that are too ashamed to say that they're blowing up their savings on that. But I don't know much about it apart from that.
Well, it's massively infiltrated sport. We're a sporting nation. And the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission has now got a dedicated team looking at crime and sport. And they believe that 25% of sport is owned or linked to organised crime. Ownership of teams, money laundering through player transfers, tipping off. And there's this sophisticated grooming where legends of sport who have themselves been compromised and tipping off bookies and all the rest of it, or throwing matches, they're compromised, right? And these organisations are so good at finding people's vulnerabilities, and they'll get an older mentor to get a younger player at the up-and-coming level, and they'll groom them for 10 years. So it's all through sport, and that's because of the gambling around sport and the potential for washing big amounts of money. Why do you think all the Russian kleptocrats wanted to own English Premier League football teams? You can move money in plain sight with player transfers. So, look, they're looking at it. You know, it's a big issue. It's one of the biggest issues that Australia faces, I believe. And you've hit the nail on the head there.
Can I just make one comment about housing? A reminder to everybody here that we have a huge homelessness issue, and in the last census there were 1 million properties that nobody lived in. That's 1/10 of the Australian property market. Just a reminder.
I did a crime walk through London with one of the characters in my book, and he walked me past the houses that the Russian oligarchs own, and they're all lights off in the middle of London.
Yeah, no, it's a huge. I went into the Sydney water just to ask, can you tell me how many places in New South Wales don't have their water turned on at the moment? I was trying to find a backdoor way to find out how many people, sort of millionaire squatters there were, and of course, or just vacant premises, and they wouldn't divulge the figure, which I thought was quite interesting. But look, we're going to be around for a chat if you want to come and have a yarn. Particularly, I would advocate buying Nathan's book. It's a great read, and thank you. It's terrific.
I'll borrow, steal it. I don't care.
It's
Sorry, I didn't say that, Mary. My publisher at the back. Buy it.
Well, it's terrific to be in Canberra. So thanks to everybody for turning up, and thanks to the National Press Club.